Think back to the first time someone told you about the 300 Spartans, or the one soldier who supposedly held a bridge alone against an army. Some part of you filed it under cool, but obviously exaggerated. I did too, for years. Case file 68 Warriors this time. The kind of names that turn into memes and documentary specials until they stop feeling like people and start feeling like action figures. One of them has a real object attached to him sitting in a museum right now. Scientists have spent actual grant money arguing over whether it is genuine. I'll get to that one last. 8 Warriors. Let's open the file. Here's something I didn't expect going into this. Warrior legends get treated worse than most myths. Honestly. A flood story still gets taken semi-seriously. A warrior story gets treated like a comic book origin because the exaggeration is obvious. Nobody killed 300 men alone. No sword was really unbreakable. So we throw out the whole thing, the exaggerated parts and the real parts, together. But warriors leave something myths about gods and floods don't leave. They leave paperwork. Tax records mention them. Enemy chroniclers who hated them still wrote down what they did, because ignoring a real threat doesn't make it stop being a threat. That is the thread through this whole file. Not was the legend true. That is the wrong question. The real question is, what is the smallest, most boring, most verifiable fact sitting underneath the legend? And does that fact survive? Sometimes it is one line in a completely unrelated document. Sometimes it is an arrowhead in the dirt. Sometimes it is a sword in a glass case that keeps getting tested. 8 Warriors. 8 separate paper trails. The last one is still an open case right now. People are actively arguing about physical proof that hasn't settled the question yet. Here is where it gets strange. Britain 6060 1 CE Case 1. Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe. Her husband dies, Rome annexes her kingdom anyway, and when she objects, Roman soldiers flog her and assault her daughters, so she raises an army and burns 3 Roman cities to the ground. Sounds like a movie poster, except 2 Roman historians wrote about her, and neither wanted to. Tacitus, whose father-in-law served in Britain around this exact period, describes her leading the revolt. Cassius Dio, writing later, describes her physically tall, harsh-voiced, a mass of reddish hair past her waist. These men had no reason to invent a woman beating Rome. Writing it down embarrassed them. Here is the part that actually stopped me. Dig under modern London, Colchester, or St. Albans in the right spot, and you hit a layer of burnt red-orange soil. Archaeologists call it the Boudican destruction layer. It has been found at all 3 sites, dated by the coins and pottery buried in it to right around 60 or 61 CE. That is not a story. That is a fire, still in the ground, exactly where the story says a fire should be. Construction crews doing ordinary building work in London still hit that layer sometimes. They know immediately what it is. An entire Roman city burned in a single event, one specific year, confirmed by 2 hostile historians and a hole in the ground that don't know about each other. Nobody ever found her body. After her final defeat, she disappears from the record. Poison, some accounts say. Illness, say others. Nobody agrees. The woman who burned 3 cities into a permanent layer of the earth doesn't have a grave anyone's found. The fire is more documented than the person who apparently started it. That gap still sits strange with me. Frankische Basque border 778 CE that got me thinking about how little it actually takes to survive. Case 2, Roland. Knight of Charlemagne, carrier of an unbreakable sword called Durandal, owner of a war horn so powerful that blowing it at full strength killed him, surrounded by a Saracen army at a mountain pass, too proud to call for help until it is too late. Dies a martyr. It is one of the most influential poems in European history, the Song of Roland, written down around the 11th century. Here is the strange part. The battle it describes happened in 778 CE. That is roughly 300 years earlier than the poem. So what do we actually have from 778 CE itself? One sentence. In a biography of Charlemagne written by a court scholar named Einhard, around 830 CE, decades after the battle, but far closer to it than the poem. Einhard is listing the men killed in an ambush at a mountain pass. He names 3. One of them, Leonidas, prefect of the Breton March. That is it. That is the entire historical footprint. No magic sword, no horn. And the attackers weren't even Saracens. Einhard says Basques, which makes sense geographically and makes for a much less dramatic enemy than the poem later chose. One line in a mostly administrative account of someone else's life is the whole reason this character exists in any factual record at all. Everything else, the pride, the horn, the doomed last stand, got built on top of that single sentence over 3 centuries of retelling. A real man, in one real ambush, on one real road, became one of the most famous knights who never technically did any of the things he is famous for. Thermopylae, Greece 480 BCE, Case 3, Leonidas. King of Sparta, 300 men hold a narrow mountain pass against a Persian army numbering in the hundreds of thousands for 3 days, until a local shepherd sells them out and shows the Persians a path around the back. You already know this one. Everyone does. Herodotus is the main source, writing maybe 50 years after the battle, and even Herodotus's numbers don't hold up perfectly. The Greek force wasn't 300 alone, it was a few thousand, Spartans plus Thespians plus a group of Thebans who apparently surrendered. The 300 is real, but it is a highlight reel, not the full head count. Here is what got confirmed, though, and it is not the part you'd expect. In 1939, an archaeologist named Spiridon Marinatos excavated a small hill at the pass, the one Herodotus calls Kolonos, the spot where the last Greeks made their final stand after being surrounded. He found bronze and iron arrowheads, Persian-style arrowheads in the dirt on that exact hill. Herodotus's account says the final stand ended with the surrounded Greeks being shot down with arrows rather than killed in melee, which, if you think about it, is a strange detail to invent. It is not a glorious way to describe your own king dying. It is the unglamorous version, and it is the version the metal in the ground agrees with, not the 300 number, not the epic single combat. The boring, embarrassing detail, cut down by archers, not swords, is the one piece of the legend that left something you can hold in your hand. Scandinavia 6th century CE, we're about a third through the file. Case 4. Beowulf. A warrior travels to help a neighboring king whose hall is being attacked nightly by a monster called Grendel. He kills it with his bare hands, kills the monster's mother in an underwater lair, and decades later, as an old king himself, dies fighting a dragon. I want to be honest with you about this one before I go further. Beowulf himself, the man, appears nowhere. Not in a single record outside the poem that bears his name. No inscription, no list, nothing, which should be the end of the case. Except it isn't quite. Beowulf's king in the poem is named Hygelac, and Hygelac shows up somewhere he has no business showing up, in a Frankish history book that has nothing to do with English poetry. Gregory of Tours, a bishop writing around 575 CE, records a raid on the Frankish coast by a king he calls Clocholaicus, a Latin mangling of a Scandinavian name that lines up almost exactly with Hygelac. Same outcome as the poem describes, killed on that very raid. Here is the part I keep sitting with. The monster killer isn't in any record, but the king he served, the raid that ends his story in the poem, that is independently confirmed in a document from a completely different country, written for a completely different reason, decades before anyone wrote the poem down. Somewhere between a real Scandinavian king's real badly timed raid and a Christian scribe writing an English epic centuries later, a fictional hero got attached to a real man's timeline. Whether there was ever a real retainer standing next to Hygelac who genuinely killed something in a hall, that part we'll probably never know. But I'll tell you which case coming up next actually made me rethink this whole video. It is the one I couldn't stop reading about for a week. Albania 1405 or 1468, CA Case 5, Skanderbeg. An Albanian nobleman, raised as a hostage in the Ottoman court, trained as an Ottoman soldier, and who then defects, goes home, and spends the next 25 years personally holding off the most powerful empire on Earth with a force a fraction of its size. The legend adds superhuman combat skill. One clean stroke through a helmet, that kind of thing. What actually holds up is almost stranger than the exaggeration. The Ottoman Empire kept meticulous administrative and military records because that is what empires do. Skanderbeg appears constantly in them, not as folklore, but as a documented, tracked, expensive problem. Sultan sent multiple full invasion forces specifically to deal with him. Venetian diplomats wrote home about him too, in ordinary correspondence, the kind meant for other diplomats, not for legend building. And there's something you can actually go look at. His helmet and his sword are preserved today in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, not replicas built for tourism, objects with a documented ownership trail going back to his family after his death. Here is what strikes me about this one. The empire that failed to defeat him ended up keeping the best written record of him, because bureaucracies document their failures just as carefully as their successes. He survived as a historical figure partly because the people who wanted him gone couldn't stop writing about him. Japan c. 1584, 1645 K6. Musashi Miyamoto, the undefeated swordsman. More than 60 duels, the legend says, and he never lost a single one. Fought with wooden swords against steel. Showed up late to fights on purpose just to unsettle opponents. This is the case with something none of the others have, his own words. Near the end of his life, Musashi wrote a treatise on strategy and swordsmanship called the Book of Five Rings. It survives. You can read it today, in his own voice, describing how he thought about combat. Several specific duels get corroborated outside his own writing, in domain records kept by the regions where they happened. The most famous one, against a swordsman named Sasaki Kojiro on a small island called Ganryu in 1612, is documented in more than one independent source. But that 60-plus number, that part gets shockier the closer you look. A handful of duels are solidly documented. The rest exist mostly in accounts written well after his death, by people who had every reason to inflate the legend of a man whose name was already good for business. What I find genuinely interesting is that this is the one case in the whole file where the person left a direct account of himself, in his own hand, and the legends still outran the paperwork anyway. Being real and being verifiable turned out to be two separate things, even for a man who wrote his own book about it. Central Europe, 434-453 CE, one case left before the one I mentioned at the start. Case 7, Attila, king of the Huns, called the Scourge of God by terrified Roman writers, leader of an empire that stretched from Central Europe toward the gates of Constantinople itself. This is one of the best documented barbarian rulers in the ancient world, and for an unusual reason. A Roman diplomat named Priscus was actually sent to Attila's camp on official business, sat at his table, and wrote down what he personally witnessed. According to that account, Attila dressed plainly while his own guests ate off silver. Not the monster the propaganda promised. A man running a court deliberately unshowy about it. He died suddenly in 453 CE on his wedding night. Most likely a burst blood vessel after heavy drinking. Later legend naturally insisted his new bride murdered him. Here is the part that is still unresolved, right now, in the present tense. A 6th century historian named Jordanes recorded the burial. Triple coffin, he says. Gold inside silver inside iron. Buried in a riverbed after diverting the river's course to hide it. Then diverted back over the grave. The men who built the tomb were reportedly killed afterward, specifically so nobody could reveal the location. That tomb has never been found. Not in the 6th century, not now. Archaeologists and amateur searchers in Hungary, Romania, and elsewhere have gone looking, on and off, for well over a century. Nothing confirmed. Every so often a new claim surfaces and gets picked apart within weeks. This is a real king. This close to us historically in terms of documentation. A dinner guest wrote about him personally, and we still can't find where he was put in the ground. Sometimes the mystery isn't whether the evidence is fake. Sometimes the mystery is that the evidence is real and just still missing. Iberia 1043-1099. This is the one I mentioned at the start. The physical object that scientists still argue over. Case 8. El Cid, Rodrigo de C.D. Vivar. The legend, the perfect Christian knight, undefeated in battle, so loyal and so feared that after his death his soldiers strapped his corpse to his horse and rode out one last time, terrifying the enemy into retreat before anyone realized he was already gone. Here is what most retellings leave out. For a long stretch of his career, he fought as a mercenary for a Muslim ruler in Zaragoza against other Christian lords. That inconvenient detail is exactly why historians tend to trust the rest of the record. It is not flattering, and nobody building a pure legend would have kept it in. A Latin chronicle called the Historia Roderici, written not long after his death, documents his career in detail, alongside separate accounts from Arabic chroniclers who had no stake in glorifying him for a Christian audience. The man himself isn't really in dispute. What is in dispute is sitting in a display case in Burgos, Spain. A sword called Tizona, said to be his personal blade, has been displayed for centuries as the genuine article. In 1999, Spain's Ministry of Defense had the sword examined at their arms museum in Toledo. Metallurgists analyzed the steel composition and dated it to somewhere around the 11th century, his exact lifetime. That is not nothing. That is a real forensic result pointing in the right direction. But dating the metal to the right century isn't the same as proving unbroken ownership across 900 years of wars, inheritances, and changing hands. Some historians consider the case closed. Others point out that a well-made 11th century sword could have belonged to plenty of people, and that consistent with his era isn't the same as his. That is why I saved this one for last. It is not a case where the evidence is weak. It is a case where the evidence is genuinely strong, and people still can't agree on what it proves. A real man, a real object, a real lab result, and a debate that isn't closed. 8 warriors. 8 completely different cultures, centuries apart, none of them aware the others existed. And the same shape keeps showing up underneath every single one. It is never the dramatic detail that survives. Nobody needed to invent the burnt layer under London, or the arrowheads on a Greek hillside, or one flat sentence in somebody else's biography. Those details are too small and too unglamorous to have been added for effect. They're the kind of thing you only get if something actually happened. The legends did their job. They kept these names alive for 1,000 years or more, long enough for someone to eventually go check. But the thing that actually held up under checking was never the magic sword or the impossible odds. It was the tax record, the burn layer, the one line nobody thought was important enough to embellish. I keep coming back to Roland especially. One sentence in someone else's book is the entire reason a 900-year-old poem has a real name to hang itself on. How many other names like that are sitting in documents nobody's cross-referenced yet? Next case, we leave warriors behind completely and go looking at something almost nobody expects to find anything real underneath. One object, one place. I still don't fully believe what turned up. Case file 7 opens soon. Has this ever happened to you? Finding out something you filed away as obviously exaggerated turned out to have a real receipt attached. Tell me exactly when you first noticed it. I read every comment. This is Professor Detective. Stay curious. The truth is always hiding in plain sight.